high-quality, wholesome milk from dedicated, passionate U.S. dairy farmers is the foundation for outstanding dairy products. Every day of the year, U.S. milk is transformed into millions of metric tons of high-quality cheese, whey proteins, lactose, milk powder, and many other dairy products. Want more choices? With hundreds of suppliers, global customers enjoy diverse options to fulfill varying tastes, mineral contents, functional properties, and more. To meet global demand, the U.S. dairy industry is continually expanding its product and ingredient portfolio. Multi-layer protection steps support consistent delivery of wholesome dairy products. From farms in the USA to tables throughout the world, this dynamic network of suppliers is embracing international markets. To discover how you can deliver a world-class portfolio of cheese and dairy ingredients, think USA Dairy.
Please allow me to officially welcome you to our webinar. We will discuss nutrition, dairy proteins compared to plant-based proteins. This webinar is being provided to you by U.S. Dairy Export Council, USDEC. I'm Carolina Nascimento, and I'm a partner of River Global. River Global represents USDEC in South America. For those of you who do not know the work carried out by USDEC, please let me share that it's an institutional service. So we represent dairy producers, but our focus is to educate the entire chain, food processing chain, and products that use dairy ingredients, dairy products. We work together with universities, importers, manufacturers, processors, and this is why this webinar is part of our education program. Our goal is to provide you information so that you can make a better use of U.S. dairy ingredients, and today we're going to focus on proteins. It's really a great pleasure to be here with you this morning. We already have a good audience. It's a cool morning here in São Paulo, and I know we already have many attendees who have joined us. I'd like just to give you an overview of this webinar. Today, our webinar will last a little bit longer than the previous ones. So please be prepared to stay with us for almost 2 hours. We have presentations that will take 1 hour and 20 minutes, and then we will open for questions. So please feel free to send us your questions, your comments. You can use the Q&A icon as well as the chat box. Now, let's proceed welcoming our dear guests and speakers. I'd like to start by welcoming my colleague from USDEC, Terry Rexroth. Terry is the Vice President for Global Marketing. Good morning, Terry.
Good morning, Carolina. Thanks for joining, everyone. We hope you enjoy our webinar today.
Muito obrigada, Terry.
Thank you very much, Terry. Today, here with us, we have two very special guests. Matthew Pikoski. Matthew is the VP of Nutrition Research for the National Dairy Council. Good morning, Matt. Welcome.
Good morning. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining. Really looking forward to engaging with you today.
Perfeito. E a nossa terceira e ilustre convidada.
Our third guest, Mary Wilcox. She is a consultant and she's also the founder of Significant Outcomes. Welcome, Mary.
It's a great honor to be here today, and I look forward to hearing from you in the chat and Q&A. Thank you.
Muito obrigada.
Thank you so much. And as you already know, if you have joined us previously, we usually have a poll. The idea is to warm up, but we also want to know a little bit more about you. We want to understand your interests and to use your answers to guide us for future events. I have 2 questions. This is on Zoom poll. First one, do you or does your company, do you have an interest in dairy protein, plant-based protein, or both? I'll give you some seconds. I see you are answering our poll. Just a comment. We usually talk about WPC, WPI, MPC, MPI, dairy proteins, and we know that as for plant-based protein, we have many sources. Perfect. So I will share the responses that we got, the results. So most of you are interested in both types of protein sources, 61%. This is very, very interesting. This was the first question. We have a second question. Let me share it now. This question is related to categories. So which categories do you believe have the highest potential for food and beverage development with proteins? We thought about baking, nutritional bars, confectionery, dairy, foods, beverages, a snack, sauces, and dressings. We did not add sports nutrition because we focused on the food industry as a whole. I'll give you some more seconds.
Nossa, bem dividido, bem interessante isso.
Oh, I see that we have many choices here. I will end the poll. Thank you very much for participating. Now let me share the results. We have a winner, dairy foods, 75%. I'd like to also highlight beverages and snacks or nutritional bars. Thank you very much for participating. And now, once again, I'd like just to remind you that we will start with the presentations. It will take approximately 1 hour, 20 minutes. It's very, very interesting. Please do send your questions using the Q&A or the chat box. And stay with us to the very end. I am sure that the Q&A session will be extremely interesting. Please do not forget to select the language of your choice at the bottom of Zoom screen. Let's start with the presentations.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our listeners, and thank you for joining our webinar. My name is Terry Rexroad, and I work in global marketing for the U.S. Dairy Export Council. We are pleased to offer today's webinar, U.S. Dairy Protein Nutrition and Functionality, what you need to know about dairy and plant-based proteins. During the webinar, please enter your questions in the box available on your screen. And at the end, we will host a Q&A session. We will answer as many questions as possible, time permitting, and all unanswered questions will be addressed by email after the webinar. First, a little about USDEC for those of you that may not be familiar with us. We are a nonprofit membership organization working on behalf of U.S. dairy farmers. Since USDEC was founded in 1995, U.S. dairy exports have increased by more than sevenfold to over $6.6 billion annually. In 2020, the U.S. dairy industry exported a record volume of 2.1 million metric tons, which is the equivalent of 16% of U.S. milk solids. We have offices located in export markets around the world, across Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America. Our global team is focused on building demand for U.S. dairy ingredients and cheese. And now I'd like to introduce our speakers. First is Matthew Pekoski, Vice President of Nutrition Research for the National Dairy Council. In this role, Matt leads the Dairy Protein Nutrition Research Program to build scientific evidence supporting the benefits of milk and dairy protein ingredients. Today, Matt will review the nutrient profiles of dairy and plant proteins, and he'll explain how dairy proteins provide unmatched nutrition benefits across all life stages. Our second speaker, Mary Wilcox, is the founder of consulting company Significant Outcomes LLC, and she has over 25 years of experience in product development and business development for food and agriculture. In today's presentation, Mary will help navigate the protein landscape by comparing the functional properties of dairy and plant proteins. These properties are critical in the successful formulation of foods and beverages. Welcome, Matt and Mary.
Hello, everyone. My name is Matthew Pekoski. I'm the Vice President of Nutrition Research with the National Dairy Council based in the US. Thanks for joining me today for my presentation titled Advantages of Dairy Proteins versus Plant Proteins with a focus on nutrition. Now, protein is an essential nutrient required by our body every day. And amino acids, which are the building blocks of protein, provide structural components needed for a number of critical body functions. While most people are familiar with the link or association between amino acids, dietary protein, and having muscle building or muscle support, there's actually a number of essential body functions that require dietary protein and then the essential amino acids from that protein. And that, as noted in that first bullet, not only strong muscle, but also the skeletal system. So, adequate protein is important to support bone health. We need protein to transport oxygen to our muscles. That's the body protein hemoglobin. Metabolize other nutrients that help with digestion and obviously getting the nutrients to our body and organs and tissues that need that. That's enzymes, which is a protein. And then healthy immune functions, certainly important in today's environment of the pandemic that we're still working through. And that's the function of immune proteins. Now, next layer of detail when you're thinking about amino acids, there are two core categories of amino acids. There is the essential or indispensable amino acids. Those amino acids are not able to be made by the body, therefore they must be supplied by the diet. And then there's the other amino acids that are called the dispensable or the non-essential amino acids. And again, those can be made by the body and don't necessarily need to be provided by the diet, although they are. So again, a focus really from diet and looking at, whether it's the total diet or individual foods, we want to look at a food's ability to provide those essential amino acids, those 9 essentials, which cannot be made by the body. They must be supplied by the diet. And we know that the essential amino acids, and in particular the branched chain amino acids, leucine, isoleucine, and valine. And then I would say over the last 10 to 15 years or so, there's been a growing body of literature and emphasis on leucine in particular as probably the most important of the essential amino acids when we're looking at stimulating and supporting muscle protein synthesis. And lastly, in a big picture, insufficient intake of essential amino acids is going to compromise the ability of tissue to grow, be repaired, or be maintained. And that's going to have ultimately a cascade of negative effects on our overall health. Now, when it comes to comparing different proteins, hopefully many of you have heard of the topic or term protein quality. And in a general sense, this helps to indicate the fact that not all proteins are created equal when it comes to the nutrition that they provide. Protein quality can be defined as the ability of a food protein to meet the body's metabolic demand for amino acids and nitrogen. And that metabolic demand, goes back to the slide, the topics that I mentioned on that first slide, right? Supporting musculoskeletal health, transport of oxygen to tissues, digestion of the food we eat through enzymes, etc. Now, food proteins vary in their protein quality based on three key factors: amino acid composition, with higher quality proteins having the full array of essential amino acids in sufficient amounts required by the body, also the digestibility of that protein, and then the bioavailability of the digested amino acids from that protein. Now, generally speaking, animal proteins are more digestible than plant proteins. And that's due to a few different factors. And primarily it's due to the other components that are found that's coming along with those proteins from that food source or ingredient source, right? And in particular, plant proteins in general, in comparison to animal proteins, have more what is called anti-nutritional factors that do inhibit either the digestion and or bioavailability of the protein and amino acids in that particular food source. Now, when it comes to protein quality scoring, there are a number of different methods available, but there's two that I'm highlighting on this slide. The first, the PDCAS, or the Protein Digestibility Corrected Amino Acid Score, that's really considered, has been around for a long time and is still considered the gold standard for assessing protein quality. It's recognized by the FDA in the United States and also is recognized internationally by groups such as the FAO. In addition, we have a more recent method called the Digestible Indispensable Amino Acid Score. So that's a new model of protein quality assessments that was recommended a few years ago by an expert panel convened by the FAO to independently review current quality assessments and make recommendations as to if a new methodology should be utilized. And again, their conclusion was that this new DIAS method will be more accurate, and you'll be seeing it, if you haven't already, in the literature more and more. The table on your left here to end this slide is comparing both PDCAS and DIAS scores of a number of different ingredients, which you can see above the red line, and then whole foods, which you can see below the red line. And what's shown, whether it's an ingredient or whole food, or whether it's with PDCAS or DIAS, is that dairy proteins are the highest quality proteins available. Again, whether it comes from ingredient or whole food source. Now, when it comes to the real world application of this protein quality and the health and or physiologic endpoints that we could assess in terms of how protein quality is impacting our health, the primary way this is looked at scientifically is its ability to promote muscle gain and or maintain muscle. And while some folks may think muscle is only important in the sports and exercise space, young active adults, athletes, and or adults who have a concern in regarding to their aesthetic appearance and the value that muscle plays there. But actually, that's an extremely small and closed-minded view, in my opinion, and I think in most scientists' opinion that are experts in this area. And that's because skeletal muscle, the quantity and quality of that muscle, play a key role in a number of ways to influence our health. You could see, plays role in strength and mobility. And of course, that's important in sport, but that's also important to support healthy aging. Think about, being in your middle-aged and older years and needing to carry groceries up a flight of stairs, or, do activities with your children and grandchildren and things of that nature. The quality and quantity of your muscle is going to be important to allow you to continue to do those well into your older years. Muscle contributes to resting energy expenditure. It's metabolically active tissue in comparison to fat, which is not, so it contributes to calorie burning. So certainly muscle has a role in connection with weight management. It's also one of the primary sites of glucose disposal. So as such, muscle plays a role in metabolic regulation and has a role in terms of supporting metabolic health. So you can see here with the greater quantity and quality of muscle that one possesses, you'll see a decreased risk for not only metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. Now, when it comes to the different physiologic processes going on in our body to kind of regulate or manage our ability to either gain, lose, or maintain muscle, we're looking at that balance between rates of muscle protein synthesis and muscle protein breakdown. And when rates of synthesis will exceed breakdown, you're going to have muscle growth. And when the opposite is true, you're going to have muscle loss. And this slide shows that there are a number of different factors that may impact this balance between synthesis and breakdown, but the primary one that we have under our control, in addition to exercise, and the one in which I'm going to focus on for my talk today, is nutrition, and then more specifically, protein nutrition. Now, when it comes to protein recommendations, I think it's really important to clarify some of the confusion or what I think is a misinterpretation of those recommendations. So in the US and globally, as well as in individual countries, we have, what in the US we deem the recommended dietary allowance, or the RDA. And that's set at 0.8 grams per kilo body weight per day for adults. And often I will see, whether it's from health professionals or whether it's the press trying to laymanize scientific information for consumers, is that they will look at this level as kind of the goal or ceiling with which protein intake should not exceed. And they talk about anything in excess of the RDA as excessive and potentially harmful for health. And that is just not accurate. The RDA, in this quote is actually from the document that outlines the RDA, is really that estimate of the minimum daily average dietary intake level that meets the requirements of nearly all healthy individuals. So again, the RDA should be viewed as a minimum amount to prevent deficiency. It is not an optimal amount to support health, or it is not a ceiling by which we should not exceed. We also have the acceptable macronutrient distribution range. So this provides, again, a range of protein intakes that can be consumed safely, okay? And as you can see the definition here, a range of intakes for a particular energy source that's associated with reduced risk of chronic disease while providing adequate intakes of essential nutrients. So that's 10 to 35% of total calories when it comes to protein. So to put that numbers into perspective, let's look at for a 70 kilogram male consuming 2,000 calories a day. The RDA for that person would be 56 grams of protein per day. But what you can see with the AMDR is that it gives a much broader range or flexibility from which individuals can personalize their protein intake depending on their health and nutritional goals. Now, there's a large and growing body of research that supports that some population groups may benefit from intakes greater than the RDA. And as you can see here, there's research around athletes and highly active adults, older adults, and those interested in weight management. And when we're talking about higher protein intakes, I'm talking at the middle to upper end of that AMDR range. Now, as we don't have the time to go through the full body of literature in today's webinar, I'd like to highlight some conclusions from recent position stands and/or papers from expert panels to kind of give us a nice grounding of what's recommended in the scientific literature today. Now, here's a position stand from 3 prominent nutrition and fitness organizations based in North America. And you can see that their total protein intake recommended for athletes and active adults is around 1.2 to 2 grams of protein per kilo body weight per day. So again, notably higher than the current RDA. They also provide recommendations for suggested meal intakes because we know not only the total amount of protein, but how that protein is distributed or consumed over the course of the day is important. So they recommend 20 to 30 grams and specifically call out high quality protein after workouts and at main meals. And one measure they use to indicate high quality protein is that they want that protein or that meal, that individual food, to deliver about 10 grams of essential amino acids. And that's what they're using as that indication of quality. And that's because research that's been done, and primarily done with various high quality proteins, has shown that the amount of protein consumed from those foods provides about 10 grams of amino acids, essential amino acids, and that maximizes the muscle protein synthesis response, which we remember is one of the key drivers for maintaining or increasing muscle. Similarly, when it comes to older adults, and here is indicated by those aged 65 and older, that expert groups have recommended higher protein intakes in comparison to the RDA. You can see the range here. A minimum protein intake for healthy adults has been recommended at about 1 to 1.2 grams of protein per kilo body weight per day. And that could go up to about 2 grams of protein per kilo body weight per day for those older adults who are dealing with severe illness or injury or marked malnutrition. Now, again, in addition to total protein intake, you can see to the right of this figure that there's additional recommendations for a certain amount of protein per meal, but also a certain amount of leucine per meal, which is, again, an indication or a proxy for the quality of that protein. And the importance of leucine with muscle metabolism and needing a certain amount of leucine, again, to be a proxy for protein metabolism, protein quality, and maximizing the muscle protein synthesis response. Now, in the literature, it's recognized that dairy proteins are some of the highest quality proteins, and they're recognized for their value and efficacy in supporting muscle health. And these quotes that are taken from 2 different position stands from these expert health professional organizations, which I have noted here, are specific to the sports and exercise space, as to that's where the largest body of literature to date has been published. And you can see from the first quote, I'll read, "To date, dairy proteins seem to be superior to other tested proteins, largely due to leucine content in the digestion and absorptive kinetics of the branched chain amino acids in fluid-based dairy foods." Now, the second quote from the International Society of Sport Nutrition is similar. I won't take the time to read it, but again, it's calling out the quality of animal proteins and dairy proteins in particular in comparison to plant proteins, again, because of that higher amount and concentration of essential amino acids, leucine, and then for the digestibility and bioavailability of those amino acids. Now, the next few slides, I think, provide some very nice and handy charts, which look at essential amino acid concentrations and then subsequently leucine concentrations as a percent of total protein within a variety of plant and animal-based sources. You see the table here to the right, summarizes comparisons of some of these more succinctly. And what you can see is that the dairy proteins have notably higher essential amino acid concentrations than the other proteins listed, and particularly in comparison to some of the popular plant proteins. So again, they're more efficient in their delivery of essential amino acids, which is going to be important for muscle health. Similar conclusion when it comes to leucine. Again, you look at both whey and casein, the 2 dairy proteins, they have the highest percent leucine concentration from a total protein perspective when you compare them to all of the other proteins. And again, look at the differences across whey and casein in comparison to some of the more popular plant-based ones, whether it's rice, soy, lentil, etc. It can be upwards of 2 times the amount or percent of leucine in comparison to some of these other sources. Now, there's some discussion certainly in the food and beverage community that these differences in protein quality from individual animal proteins or dairy proteins in comparison to plant proteins can be, accounted for or made up for by blending, whether it's 2 or more plant protein ingredients together. And if by doing that, there's a thought that you might be able to match in terms of quality. Well, here is a recently published study that examined that exact question. So what you could see, and the number of, the different blends are shown below the table here, is that there are 3 different plant protein blends, and they were compared to whey protein isolate. So the C in the table is the whey protein isolate, and then numbers 1 through 3 are different plant protein blends. And what they did is that they matched for total leucine content, PD-CAS score, and total essential amino acid content. And again, theoretically, they should have the same response in the body given the efforts made to match on those factors. Now, there's one thing I want to point out here before we look at some of the results from this study is that, the simple fact that in order to match the leucine and essential amino acid content from the whey protein isolates, the 3 different blends had to provide about 10 grams more of total protein. So again, that shows the efficiency with which whey protein isolate in this example specifically is delivering those key amino acids, essentially the efficiency with which it's going to support muscle health. Now, this first figure here looks at, changes in blood essential amino acids, total amino acids, over the 4 hours in which they were measured. And you could see, despite matching for essential amino acid content and leucine content, the whey protein isolate group has a much higher, significantly higher blood levels of the essential amino acids. Here's another figure which just shows area under the curve. So for the total 4-hour period, again, blood levels of essential amino acids, which are important to support the muscle response to protein consumption, was significantly higher in comparison to all the blends. And, I'm not going to show the figures, but the leucine concentrations also were higher. You could see 28 to 35% higher for the whey protein isolate in comparison to the 3 different blends. So what this is showing is that, there's something beyond just the amino acid composition. Again, it's got to come down to either the digestibility and or ultimately bioavailability. Now, additional work would be needed to kind of look at, what's the physiologic or health impact of these differences in plasma amino acid responses. But in subsequent slides, I'm going to show some of the work that's been done that, again, would lend you to believe that these differences in blood amino acid levels is important. So again, for transitioning, I'm going to look at some of the data that's directly compared dairy versus plant proteins when it comes to muscle health. Just to orient you, typically what's done is either measuring muscle protein synthesis, which on subsequent slides you'll see is indicated by FSR or fractional synthetic rate on the graphs, and or measuring the amount of muscle gained over time. That's done with protein consumption, with or without exercise training. So this first study looked at whey protein in comparison to casein and then soy in a group of young adults, and it looked at it at rest and then after resistance exercise. And one thing to note here is that, what the investigators did in this experiment were actually try to match essential amino acid delivery. So they had to give a little bit more soy in comparison to whey protein to match providing 10 grams of essential amino acids. So, interestingly, this is really looking at potential differences from a digestibility and bioavailability perspective when it comes to whey and soy. And what you could see is that after exercise, the whey protein group resulted in significantly higher muscle protein synthesis in comparison to the soy group. Now, when we look at, again, those blood essential amino acid levels, you can see particularly at the early time periods, 30 and 60 minutes, whey protein is in this upper line, had higher total essential amino acids in comparison to the soy and casein groups. And similarly, when it comes to leucine, again, at 30 and 60 minutes, significantly higher plasma levels of leucine from the whey group in comparison to the other two groups. And again, that's likely part of the mechanism that's driving the benefit when it comes to greater muscle protein synthesis. Now, the next question would be, do acute or short-term differences in muscle protein synthesis over time impact the amount of muscle gained? And here's one of the longest training studies, one of the longest controlled training studies that's been done and published to date. There's a 9-month resistance training program, including previously untrained college-aged men and women. They supplemented daily with about 20 grams of either whey protein, soy protein, or calorie-matched carbohydrate control. And they did a routine resistance exercise training, again, over 9 months. And what you can see here on the left is that the whey protein group gained significantly more muscle, 3.3 kilograms of muscle over the 9-month period, in comparison to the soy group, who gained 1.8, and then the carbohydrate group, who gained 2.3 kilograms of muscle. So again, these acute differences in muscle protein synthesis are likely what contributed to these greater gains in muscle mass over time. Just to again show you some of these differences in blood amino acid levels, and here looking at leucine specifically in the 60 minutes post-exercise, either in the untrained state to the left or the trained state after 9 months of training to the right. And again, the whey protein group, you see notably higher leucine in the blood in comparison to the other two supplemented groups. Now, similar positive results, whether comparing whey protein or milk in comparison to soy protein ingredient or soy beverage, have been demonstrated in other studies with resistance exercise. And that's been shown in both old and younger adults. Now transitioning outside of the sports and exercise realm into the weight management realm. And as I alluded to in the previous slide, muscle can play an important role in weight management in terms of supporting energy expenditure. And certainly from a health standpoint, it's going to be preferential to maintain muscle during weight loss while preferentially losing body fat. And we know research has generally established that during a weight loss diet where you're eating less calories than are required for your energy needs, that higher protein diets will help to preserve muscle during that weight loss period. What hasn't been shown is there a difference between the quality of protein provided within that scenario? So this study looked to address that question. So we had 40 overweight and obese men and women, about middle-aged, 50 years old, a 14-day weight loss diet. They supplemented 2 times a day with either whey protein, soy protein, or carbohydrate. And to the right here is the figure, is the results. Again, at the beginning of the 14-day period, and then at the end of the 14-day weight loss period. And the 3 primary findings are: 1, whey protein exceeded soy protein when it came to muscle protein synthesis, right? Whether it was at the beginning of the trial or the end of the 14-day weight loss period, rates of muscle protein synthesis were significantly higher for whey in comparison to both soy and carbohydrate. Additionally, whey protein attenuated the decline in post-meal rates of muscle protein synthesis after weight loss compared to soy protein. And what this is going to do over time is ultimately this may lead to a greater preservation of muscle during long-term weight loss interventions, which again is going to be a preferential outcome. So protein quality here examined between providing whey protein in comparison to soy does seem to impact muscle metabolism in a weight loss phase, and again, which may lead to preferential changes in body composition over time. Now, the next group I want to look at is older adults, and again, that category of healthy aging. And we know muscle is critically important for older adults because, as we age, we do lose muscle. We also lose muscle strength and function. And what that leads to is sarcopenia. And we know that sarcopenia has a significant number of health problems that it causes: increases rates of falls and fractures, increases dependent living, also increases morbidity and mortality. So, this study looked at 20 healthy older adults and actually did a bed rest model. So this is kind of a few days of bed rest, which would be similar to acute hospitalization, and or if you were just laid up in bed at home due to an illness or injury or something similar. So again, a 7-day bed rest study followed by 5 days of rehabilitation to see if they could gain back some of the function that was lost during the rest period. Diets were matched for total calories and macronutrient composition, but the quality of the diets were varied. As in the whey diet, there was about 10 to 15 grams of whey protein provided at each meal, and that was swapped out from some other proteins that were provided at those meals in the mixed diets. Again, to improve the overall quality of the protein in the diet via whey protein. So here you could see the total protein provided from the mixed diet and the whey groups, both during the bed rest period and the 5-day rehabilitation period. And actually, while they were trying to match these protein intakes, the whey groups had a bit less or a bit lower total protein intake when it came to bed rest and rehabilitation. You could also see just the percent animal and plant proteins within the two diets. Again, slightly more animal protein, again, because they delivered that through some additional whey protein. But overall, I would say both of these diets are generally would be looked on as pretty high quality. But let's see, what did, supplementing a modest amount of whey protein at each meal do for these individuals? Well, we saw that bed rest, or these investigators saw that bed rest resulted in a decrease in muscle mass and strength in both groups. However, the whey diet was able to partially protect leg lean mass in comparison to the mixed diet. The whey group also lost more fat mass than the mixed group during bed rest. And lastly, following the 5-day rehabilitation period, the whey group experienced a full recovery of muscle strength, while the decrement in strength persisted in the mixed group. So again, this could have significant implications, not only for medical nutrition, both during and post hospital discharge, but also, in older adult nutrition in general. When we have periods of decreased activity, being cognizant of trying to include higher quality proteins in your diet can be beneficial. Now, I do want to acknowledge that there are studies that demonstrate that these differences in protein quality between dairy proteins and plant proteins or lower quality proteins can be accounted for by simply consuming a greater amount, higher amounts of lower quality protein. And this figure on the right here is trying to illustrate that concept by showing different amounts of rice protein isolate or whey protein isolate, and how those different amounts across higher increasing levels would ultimately help one to get into this threshold, this ideal range for a certain amount of leucine, which we have here, 1.7 to 3.5 grams of leucine. And that's, once you exceed that range, you're not getting an additional benefit. So a good analogy to think of, you could think of your muscle as kind of a cup. And the protein and amino acids going into that muscle is like pouring water into a cup. And there's going to be a point at which you are pouring amino acids or pouring water into that cup, where that cup becomes full. That water is no longer beneficial. It just overflows and is essentially goes unused. And that's how you could look at this muscle full effect, or the ability of different proteins to fill that cup, and then by which providing additional protein or additional essential amino acids is no longer going to have an effect. So with a lower quality protein, it's less efficient at filling that cup, but if you provide enough of it, that cup will eventually be filled. So here you could see supplementation with whey protein or rice protein at 48 grams per day resulted in similar improvements in body composition and exercise performance following 8 weeks of resistance training in young men. Now, the point here is that what we've seen, and if you recall the recommendations from the position stands for sports and exercise to maximize the muscle response to training, recommended somewhere about 20 to 30 grams, or about 10 grams of essential amino acid. So this greatly exceeded that, but that higher level was needed from this lower quality protein in order to provide enough of those essential amino acids to get the effect. Similar concept here in older men, 35 grams of casein, but not wheat protein hydrolysate increased muscle protein synthesis, but then 60 grams of wheat protein hydrolysate was needed to increase muscle protein synthesis in those older men. Lastly, 70 grams of microprotein increased muscle protein synthesis to a greater extent than milk protein. However, look at the amounts. Again, 70 grams of microprotein, which provides a mix of total protein and some carbohydrate in comparison to, less than half milk protein, 26 grams. Again, so these are not, gram for gram comparisons. In this instance in particular, you had to provide more in order to get that effect. Now, some may say, what's the problem with providing a bit more? Just eat a bit more plant protein, you'll get similar benefits. Well, I think that is a particular thing to consider and may not be the most prudent recommendation when you think about, the extremely high rates of overweight and obesity throughout the world that we're faced with today, right? Simply recommending to the general population, just eat more plant protein to get those benefits that are derived from dairy proteins, is not prudent when, with eating more protein, you're going to bring more calories, and which could be contributing to weight gain. Here you can see from a review paper from Dr. Bob Wolf, looking at the kilocalories, per gram of protein for a number of different plant and animal sources, right? And what you can see, again, whey protein specifically is most efficient, and then, animal proteins are going to be more efficient than plant proteins when it comes to delivering essential amino acids in comparison to the amount of calories. And I'll read the quote here to summarize from Dr. Wolf. The essential amino acid to calorie ratio for high protein foods must also be considered when comparing protein-rich foods. High quality proteins such as milk proteins enable essential amino acid requirements to be met with less caloric intake compared to lower quality proteins. So again, this is going to have significant implications for the general population who already are looking for ways to reduce calories in their diet, while then, juxtaposition to likely wanting to or needing to increase protein intakes to get some of those benefits that we reported in previous slides. Now, here's another way to look at the similar concept. So if you recall, there are some experts suggesting for aiming somewhere between 2.5 to 3 grams of leucine per meal to help maximize muscle protein synthesis. So what this table does is look at, whey protein isolate in comparison to soy protein isolate, and then a number of different animal and plant-based foods, and the amount that would be need to consumed to get 2.5 grams of leucine. And it looked at in terms of, as you can see, the calories to get 2.5 grams of leucine, at the lowest amount, whey protein, 100 calories, and just goes up significantly from there when you go from to soy protein isolate to then whole foods, chicken, canned tuna, etc., down to some of these plant-based portions, which again are just not efficient with which they deliver leucine in this case, and a number of more calories are coming with that. And again, you could see, total protein is getting much higher as you go to lower quality proteins in order to get that amount of leucine. So again, we're in the big picture, we're talking about the efficiency with which dairy proteins optimally deliver these essential amino acids and leucine in a highly digestible, highly bioavailable form that's going to maximize and support muscle health. So in terms of my key takeaways for this webinar, again, dairy proteins are the highest quality proteins available, and that's been shown most recently with this newly recommended way to assess protein quality from that expert panel convened by the FAO, the digestible indispensable amino acids score. And that could be due to any one of and/or combination of the 3 different components that influence protein quality, right? That's a superior amino acid composition, having the full array of essential amino acids in the optimal amounts to support the body's needs, Also, may have higher digestibility and/or bioavailability of those essential amino acids due to less anti-nutritional factors that can limit those things which are higher in different plant foods. Now, when you think of the real world implications of protein quality, it looks at the ability of a protein to support muscle protein synthesis and how that then translates to muscle health. Now, some may have traditionally thought of this primarily in the sports nutrition world, but actually, hopefully you've learned through the information I've taken you through today, that actually has broad implications across the lifespan. And I've highlighted examples both with weight management and healthy aging. The available data supports that dairy proteins, and primarily whey protein from the literature that's been published, are superior to plant proteins in stimulating muscle protein synthesis. And differences in protein quality, while they can be accounted for by consuming a greater amount of lower quality protein, we need to think of the unintended consequences of making such a general blanket recommendation. I did highlight the implications in terms of consuming additional calories and how that could impact, weight management. What I didn't really have time to indicate, but I do want to mention here and seed it for further discussion, is that this also has implications in the need to produce more plant proteins in order to provide more total protein that would need to be consumed to match this protein quality, or actually match the health benefits from consuming more lower quality proteins. And what does that mean from a sustainability perspective? We know that sustainability is growing in importance, not only with consumers, scientists, and actually policy makers when you're looking at global implications of our food system. So when you're looking at different proteins, you need to think about it from a sustainability perspective, not only simply on the weight of the protein and how that might impact environmental considerations, but can that be corrected for protein quality? And there is research that's been published to show that when different environmental impacts such as greenhouse gas are expressed based on the quality of that protein, it really diminishes that difference in environmental impact when you're looking at plant proteins in comparison to dairy protein. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to addressing any questions you may have.
This is Mary Wilcox, and I'm the owner of Significant Outcomes, LLC. That I work with clients side by side to help them identify opportunities in the food industry. And more specifically, I have spent the majority of my career working in protein. So the purpose of my talk today is to bring you some information about the protein landscape. As you know, in the media these days, everywhere you look, there's a headline about a new source of protein, a new company delivering proteins, and the field is starting to get a little more crowded, which is fine, but it also can be confusing and you may not know where to go. So that's the point of my presentation today, is to help you identify what are those protein sources that are out there, but also how do they compare? What do they look like? And then also to let you know what US dairy protein and their role is in this landscape as well. So let's dig in. As I said, in my career, the ingredient options have changed. When I first started my career over 25 years ago, we had our choice of soy, hydrolyzed collagen, and whey protein, but whey protein was still relatively new on the market at the time. And now today we have more options than ever before, and there are more that are continuing to emerge. So let's go through what those look like. But before we do that, as formulators and business managers and sourcing agents, I know that you are in charge of delivering formulations that are successful to meet the everyday challenges of consumers. But in order to do that, it's very complicated. And this hexagon represents the key areas of information that are required when you're making those decisions about what your final concept is going to look like. So as you can see here, we have nutrition, processing, functionality, usage, supply, and sustainability. But for today's focus, we're going to not cover nutrition. There's been a lot of clinical nutrition science around protein and high quality protein diets and the impact that they have and why they're vital for life, but there's such a depth of information there. We'll handle that in a separate presentation. But for my talk today, let's start with processing. So processing can vary by the source material. As you look here, you'll see that we have flours, concentrates, and isolates. And of these three sources, if you look at the chart, if you go from left to right, you can see that flours generally require fewer steps. Concentrates require a few more steps, and they tend to be concentrated to higher levels of protein, around 80%, give or take, depends upon the source. Isolates, on the other hand, tend to be over 80% and many of them over 90%. So as you can imagine, there are additional steps required to further concentrate and purify the isolates. So just remember, in general, as you increase in protein, there is more processing required. The other thing I want to talk about is the dairy cow. She's actually very uniquely designed. The cow itself has a 4-chambered stomach, and of her 4-chambered stomach, the rumen in particular is pretty unique. She can consume things that are insoluble and also undigestible by humans. 80% of what she eats is material that we as human beings can't even digest. So she can take in those insoluble and undigestible materials. And in the rumen, the microorganisms that exist there help to digest that food into precursors for protein. Those precursors are then reassembled in the cow and excreted out the mammary system as this water-soluble, highly nutritious matrix called milk. That milk can then be turned into nutrient-rich foods and beverages that we can enjoy. And then the undigestible components are excreted and can be used as fertilizer on cropland to help replenish the soil that growing the crops and the plants may have depleted. But the key thing here, other than the fact that she is very unique in what she does as this converter of inedible materials into nutritious materials, is she turns insoluble into water soluble. So keep that in mind as we continue to discuss processing. So for about 30 years now, the dairy industry has been researching ideas of ways to physically separate milk into its components. So separating the protein from the fat and the different nutritional components within milk. As a part of that, one of the technologies that has proliferated the industry is a physical separation that uses membrane filtration and water. So think of it as the same or similar type of system as you would have for a water filtration system at home. But in this case, they use that to filter out the protein or fat and carbohydrates into different fractions. The nice thing about this is it's physical, it's gentle. It also helps maintain the co-products that come off. So in the case of milk and whey, the co-product that comes off is called permeate, pictured here. And that permeate can then be isolated and turned into other higher value applications for food usage. So protein processing, as I said, can start from the raw materials or it can start from co-products. So on this slide, you'll notice that this is from the raw material. And this is a study that was just conducted last year, comparing what the protein processing schematics might be of different materials. So on the left, you have milk protein, and as you can see, we separate the cream and then filter, concentrate, and dry. When you compare that to pea protein, rice, wheat, or chickpea, you can see that there's different steps depending upon what you start with. They may have to grind or dehull or split or extract or enzyme or wash or decant. There's different types of purification processes involved. I would say just in general, and if you look at the ones with the red boxes in particular, those steps tend to use solvents, salts, acids, and bases. So there is some kind of a conversion in order to solubilize the protein. On this slide, this is where we're starting from the co-products. So whey proteins, as an example, is a co-product of the cheese-making industry. And so that's why we're starting with whey. But once again, we have the separation, filtration, concentrating, and drying. If you look at soy, almond, potato, and canola, you'll also see there's some additional steps, once again, to precipitate, neutralize, extract, and pre-prepare the products to solubilize those proteins. I would say just in general, a general rule of thumb, the more steps there is to any process, the greater the opportunity there is for the native protein structure to change or be altered based upon the process. So what might those processing conditions be? Well, they could be temperature, pH, pressure, solutes, or mixing, and I'll explain a little bit more. But the key here is not the conditions themselves. It's the fact that when they become extreme, that's when your protein becomes at risk of changing its structure and ultimately its solubility and functionality, which we'll talk about later. So temperature, denaturation. Denaturation is just the impact of temperature, which it could be heating, cooling, or freezing, causing the proteins to unfold. That unfolding can change how the proteins are structured and function. But if you go too far, you can actually break or change the proteins in an irreversible way. An example of this is think about your morning breakfast. You have a fresh egg that you crack open. It's a liquid. When you put it in a frying pan with heat, what happens? The protein denatures and changes. The protein then becomes a solid that cannot go back to being a liquid. So that's just a visual example of what that might include. But as I said, denaturation can happen multiple ways. As far as pH, that's based upon the acidity and alkalinity of the protein. Proteins have an isoelectric point, and that point is when the neutral or the charge on the protein becomes neutral. When that happens, the proteins are more susceptible to precipitation. So acidity is a very important thing, and alkalinity, when you're thinking about how you process and how long you subject your proteins to different pHs. Pressure is another one. Solutes is a common one. So as I was saying earlier about the need for solubilization of protein in order to extract it, salt is a common way that many plant-based sources do that. So as they're adding the salt and solubilizing the protein, if there's too extreme, like there's too much, basically it can backfire and the proteins can precipitate in a way that is not desired from a process perspective. So keeping careful control of salt and sugar, both during processing and in finished product, is important to consider. Last but not least is shear. Shear is basically anything that causes the protein to break during mixing. It could be anywhere in your process. So it's important to engineer your processes with this in mind so that you can treat your proteins as gently as possible. So form impacting performance. As I just said, process then impacts the performance, and it does that through two different ways. There's functional properties and there's sensory properties. The functional properties are how ingredients behave. So how they work in your finished product from the time that you produce it and cook it and prepare it until the time you eat it. So depending upon your protein, it may function differently in different applications, which we'll discuss in a little while. Sensory evaluation is basically focused on sight, smell, taste, touch, and hearing. Once again, your process can also impact those characteristics, and we will discuss those in more detail. So functional properties. These are the general functional properties that occur in common food and beverage applications. So as you can see here, we have things that we're concerned about depending upon the application. For instance, we may need foaming. We may need water holding capacity. We may need emulsification, say in a super gravy. It just depends upon the application. So we'll go through a benchmarking study that took place to help you understand how these functionalities exist and what they mean as you're thinking about your proteins of choice for your formulations. So this benchmarking study specifically looked at water holding capacity, viscosity, heat stability, emulsion activity and stability, and foam activity and stability. So water holding capacity. I won't go into great detail on our methodologies, but I included them here for your information in case you decide you want to utilize some of them in your benchmarking that you do in-house. But specifically, water holding capacity is really an indication of how well that protein is soluble and can hang on to the water in your finished product. You'll also see on these slides as we go through them, off to the right, there's a protein legend. That legend dictates, if you look at the bottom of each protein source that was tested in this study, it has an abbreviation. So you can refer to that to understand which one is which. But that will be consistent throughout the slides that I'll be sharing. So here, when it comes to water holding capacity, you can see that milk, soy, and pea were greater than whey, potato, or rice. You can also see viscosity when it comes to water holding capacity, another common measurement that's taken. As far as viscosity goes, this was measured with a viscosimeter, and the methodology is here for your information. And in this case, they used a 10% solution at room temperature for each protein source. As you can see, the milk and pea protein had higher viscosities than the whey, soy, potato, and rice. So with this in mind, with the water holding and viscosity, depending upon your application, you may choose certain proteins or not based upon the target of your final formulation. So if you're looking for something that is thicker or has a certain mouthfeel, or you need that water holding capacity to improve the structure or the texture of your product, you may choose a milk protein or a pea protein versus a whey in this situation. Heat stability. So this specifically is measuring how stable the proteins remain after heating at different pHs. And specifically, it's measuring the sediment or the protein falling out of solution. So the larger the value, in this case, the lower the heat stability. So it's desired to have a low value for better performance. So this slide shows heat stability at pH 3. So pH 3 would be a typical pH of a high acid, low pH, hot fill type process for finished products for a beverage, as an example. So as you can see here, whey protein actually performed better than the plant proteins and milk protein. And whey protein, and especially whey protein isolate, is well known for the fact that it performs well in these low pH conditions. And unlike some of the other proteins, it does provide clarity. So you can actually have a clear beverage or frozen item where you could have opacity and change the appearance. Heat stability at pH 7, however, differ. When you look at 7, which is more of a neutral pH, you see milk and whey protein performing better than the plant proteins. So if you're looking at more of an aseptic product from a beverage perspective, you might want to consider a milk or a whey protein versus one of the plant sources because of the stability. It depends upon the process of your finished product and how it will, what it will go through before it reaches the consumers. Emulsion activity and stability is another thing. So emulsions are basically when you have small droplets of liquids that combine together in a homogeneous way. It's very, very important to soups and sauces and gravies, and basically it's that idea of having an oil and a protein that exists together in a smooth sauce so that you don't detect separation. So the actual tests here, you'll notice they're centrifuged to see if there's separation. And there was two ways that they measured it. One was did it separate? And then secondly, what happened after heating and cooling? So the emulsion activity specifically here showed that milk and whey proteins, pea and soy, outperformed the potato and rice. However, after heating and cooling, you'll notice that the milk proteins and the whey protein concentrates outperformed the pea, soy, potato, and isolate. So if you were looking for something, like I said, specifically in a soup or a sauce, where you need that emulsion to hold together to maintain the visual appearance and the mouthfeel that you're looking for in your finished product, you may want to look at some of these proteins specifically for those types of applications. Foaming ability and foam stability. Many times in confections and baked goods, you need foam to help form the structure of your finished product. These abilities were tested via Vitamix 2 blender, And basically, first it was the initial foamability, and then they waited 30 minutes to determine how stable that foam was. Did it maintain itself? So when it came to foamability, here we see whey proteins were better than the soy and potato, milk, pea, and rice. So if you're looking for a foaming protein, you may want to consider whey proteins in a baked good, for example. And stability-wise, you can see here as well, whey and then milk formed more stable foams than the plant-based proteins. So once again, depending upon the complexity of your application, you may want to consider their use. So censor, this was the other part of consumer acceptance. Proteins were rehydrated and then a trained panel tasted them. They were in duplicate and they tried them in 12 sessions to analyze the data. As you can see by this spidergram here, it shows the different intensities of the aromas. So for instance, if you look at bitter, the longer peak there is rice. When you see milky cooked, that's the milk protein. So those just give you some examples of how to read this. But the real key thing to remember is that there are flavor differences between plant and dairy proteins. As you can see here, on each side, there are some very unique flavors for each group, but there are some shared flavors between the two groups. I would say, just a general rule of thumb, as you increase the protein level of your protein sources, you'll tend to need higher levels of flavor in order to detect it in your applications. Also, depending upon the source that you're using, you may want to choose savory versus sweet or different levels of flavor in order to achieve your final product targets. This is also another reason why in some applications, plant proteins do require the use of masking agents in addition to flavor to hide some of the more plant-specific flavor profiles that come through. So appearance, we want to look at appearance depending upon your application at different pHs, as I mentioned before. So this was more of an aseptically processed product at 5% protein and specifically at neutral pH. And as you can see, there are some color and opacity differences. So depending on your final target of what you want to create, you may choose different proteins accordingly. When you go to pH 3, which is the higher acid, hot fill type conditions, which you'll see here, these beverages were heated to 82 C for 2 minutes. They do perform differently. The rice separated out right after processing, and the pea was actually after overnight. I will say that it's very important to think about your final process of your final application when choosing your proteins. It's also important to screen proteins from different sources. Even when within types of protein, different sources, because of those processing conditions I mentioned before, may perform differently. And so you need to assess that before you take it to your application. The proteins were also evaluated in bars. And this was a common bar where they made a 30% protein, 30% fat, 40% carbohydrate bar. They also put it into extended shelf life, accelerated shelf life, to determine what would happen with bar hardness. As you can see, the dairy-based proteins tended to be lighter in color, and then specifically the whey protein performed the best when it came to hardness. The plant-based were mixed. So for example, rice at the bottom that turned dark, it did not hurt, and it did well in hardness score, but it definitely turned dark. So a lot of times formulators will use blends of proteins in order to achieve just the right texture and chewability of their bars. So usage and versatility. So as I've been sharing here, all proteins are not equal, and selection really does matter. So here's some applications that I wanted to give you as examples, just to show you the breadth of what protein can deliver. As you can see here, proteins can be used in many applications across day part, and they can also be in different styles. So for instance, on the bottom left corner, we have the lentil power soup. The lentil soup has 20 grams of protein, and it combines the the benefits of both the plant-based and the dairy-based protein sources into one product. Specifically on the dairy side, it uses micellar casein and MPC because they provide a lot of heat stability for the thermal processing that a soup will go through. They also use permeate to help prevent high levels of sodium by permeate itself being a flavor enhancement. But you can also see like the wellness wafer. It only has 5 grams of protein. It could easily be considered a snack and used in that perspective to get in some extra protein. This one specifically, though, uses the whey crisps, and the crisps were put in there to give it that extra little bit of crunchy texture to the formulation. But it also used the protein to bind it together to form the actual wafer. As you can see with the flatbreads and the bites, you also have the opportunity to incorporate many ingredients, both proteins, permeates, and even yogurt and cheese to add different flavor dimensions, as well as to give you the textural properties that you're looking for in your final application. Same thing with the biscotti. You know, it's very important to get the right texture depending upon your baked good. And in that case, it uses the skim milk powder in addition to the protein to provide that texture. So supply security. We definitely need ample, consistent, safe supply. Who wants to launch a new product and then suffer shortages or recalls or issues that will disappoint your customers? So it's very important to consider. So this slide shows an example from 2016 of the different amounts of different protein sources globally. As you can see, soy and dairy are more mature and more well-established as an industry in their volumes, as some of the other plant sources are still coming online. This is an important consideration because they are still limited in their total supply, and as they're scaling up new operations and facilities, they still have to figure out all of the different processing in order to make sure you have consistent supply. So it's very important to benchmark your products and your ingredients over time to ensure that you're getting the solubility and functionality and performance that you're looking for. Dedication to quality and safety. Here in the US, the dairy industry is dedicated to testing from farm to fork, but this dedication also extends back to the farm. Farmers came together to come up with a voluntary and monitored approach to provide best-in-class animal care for their cows, and it has been ISO approved for international audiences. So this basically helps the farmers know the best practices and be audited to make sure they're following the best practices in cow care. So sustainability. We all know a lot of people are interested in this area. The dairy proteins actually have had life cycle assessments since 2012 and have continued to look at new technologies to make improvements so that they can continue to lower their impact. So let me give you some examples. Since 1950, we as an industry, in the dairy industry, milk fewer cows but make more milk. So the use of technology and genetics and feeding programs have helped improve this efficiency, which has also helped lower the carbon footprint. US dairy farmers have also used technologies to change how they use their resources. So between 2007 and 2017, you can see here, they've used 30% less water, 21% less land for the same gallon of milk, and they've produced 19% less greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, when you look at the total greenhouse gas emissions for US dairy, it accounts for 2% of the global greenhouse gas emissions versus, say, transportation, that's over 28%. So they continue to work and improve in this area. They also are looking at water, and because they use a water filtration system and the fact that milk is 87% water, dairy proteins in particular have the ability to use water, reuse water at every step of the way, whether it be in process, as each co-stream is taken off, water can be filtered out and purified, and then be used to clean facilities, equipment, run the boilers, used in the landscaping and so forth. And the same thing on farm. Water there can also be recycled. So it really helps when it comes to efficiency and yield. The U.S. dairy farmers and processors also have an ongoing commitment to sustainability, and they have said they will report on meaningful progress every 5 years. So we know consumers are demanding a lot, and you as formulators and business managers have a lot to perform to meet their demands. They're looking for complete nutrition for their diets and their health and wellness. They want visual appeal because they want to know that it's high quality and it's a premium product. They want to explore global taste profiles and experience new textures to delight their taste buds. They're also very interested in easy to understand, clean labels for ingredients. They want to know that the ingredients are sustainably produced so that for the planet. And last but not least, they want consistent and safe supply that they know and they can trust to feed their families. So all of these different elements is a lot to deliver. But I hope you can see, based upon what I've shared today, that U.S. dairy ingredients do have the ability to deliver convenient solutions to meet these demands. So just so you know, and we go back to the hexagon, there's lots of information that you may need as you're making your formulation decisions. So please feel free to visit thinkusadairy.org and their staff members for additional information. There's a lot of concepts and prototypes there for you to look at. There's technical information on functionality and understanding how an ingredient might function in your application. And they also have a database there to help you locate a U.S. dairy ingredient supplier that may have the type of ingredient you're looking for your specific application. So with that, I will say thank you for your time and attention. As I said, I own Significant Outcomes, LLC. Listed here is a portfolio of my services. If I could ever be of assistance, please reach out. Thanks again, and have a great day.
Thank you, Matt and Mary, for sharing your valuable insights. Today's nutrition and functionality overview of dairy and plant proteins showcases the truly unique package provided by U.S. dairy proteins. They offer strong functionality advantages to food and beverage processors, as well as unmatched nutrition benefits across all life stages. All proteins are not created equal, and no other type of protein ingredient offers the range of specific and quantifiable benefits provided by highly functional, nutritious, minimally processed, mild flavored U.S. dairy proteins. As mentioned earlier, we're also very proud of our sustainability story, which is a cycle that starts with the U.S. dairy farmers' commitment to unparalleled care and management of their cows to reduce the carbon footprint. The United States is one of the largest milk producers in the world, with the average U.S. cow producing 4 times more milk than the average global cow. This greater per cow productivity results in the U.S. having the smallest greenhouse gas emissions per unit of milk produced compared to other regions in the world. In closing, I'd like to mention a USDEC resource entitled A New Era for Protein: Why U.S. Dairy Delivers in the Crowded Protein Marketplace. This free report can be found at thinkusadairy.org, and it details a comparison of protein ingredients from different sources based on their functionality and sensory attributes. USDEC and the U.S. dairy industry are your innovation partners, and our offices around the world are ready to assist you in a variety of ways, such as providing formulation and application ideas, technical support, and identifying dairy ingredient suppliers to meet your specific needs. Thank you very much for participating in our webinar today. We hope you found it useful.
Estamos aqui de volta, gente, depois das
We're
apresentações.
back after our presentations today. I'd like to thank our 3 speakers and their valuable contribution. I'd like to say that we did receive many questions during the presentation. But once again, I'd like to encourage you to send us more questions using the Q&A icon. But before we move forward, I'd like to let you know that we are recording this webinar, and the recording will be made available to all of you. We are also going to provide you a certificate. It will be sent to your email. So let's start with some questions. I'd like to ask our panelists to please open their cameras so that we can start the Q&A session. First question comes from Marcelo. It's a technical question. I believe that Mary and Terry can certainly contribute in answering the question. How can we reduce the foaming in the water dissolution process of WPI? So Mary, can you please answer that?
Sure, I would be happy to. Foaming is a very important thing to control when you're dealing with proteins, whether it be whey or milk, but it tends to be a bigger concern with whey-based proteins. So it's important to think about your whole process. So you need to, first of all, you need to make sure you have good water quality, because the water quality, the mineral content can impact your proteins and how they go into solution, but also how they perform once they're in solution, which may cause you other issues later in your process when you're pH adjusting and heat treating. So it's important to always check your water source, and that's something that's often overlooked. Then when you get to the actual hydration or mixing part of it, there's a couple things you can do. Obviously, whey proteins, we tend to have people mix them in about half of the water at a little higher rate and then slow down, because you want to minimize the agitation. That's what's helping to create the foam. But obviously you need to get your mix started. So you can do it for a little bit at a higher speed and then slow down to a lower speed to give it that time of hydration. Whey proteins in particular need about 20 to 30 minutes to fully hydrate. And milk proteins actually take longer and tend to need a higher temperature water for mixing. So, you know, making sure that it's gentle and not too fast. Some people do put in some additional recirculation and mixing apparatuses, and that's fine too, because it depends on if you have a batch or a continuous system. But the other key concern there is think about your recirculation, make sure it is properly insulated so you're maintaining a constant state for your mix. But also anytime you can limit the number of turns or the length of that recirculation, that will also minimize the amount of agitation in total as you're hydrating your proteins. Also, pre-blending your ingredients together can also help minimize that foaming situation. And of course, there are commercial food grade defoamers that people use as well.
Muito interessante. Terry,
Very interesting. Terry, would you like to jump in and add anything else?
I think Mary covered that pretty completely, but I will say that, you know, she mentioned defoamers there at the end, and sometimes even if you do all of those things that Mary suggested, you're still going to have some foam. And food grade defoamers, such as silicone-based defoamers, are pretty widely used and widely accepted. And because of the low use rate, they're considered processing aids and don't need to be, you know, included on your ingredient label. So they're a very good and common solution as well.
Muito obrigada.
Thank you very much. Actually, I'd like to also share that last year we had a webinar about protein applications with some lab work done. So let's keep in touch. I can send you the link for that webinar. And I know we addressed foaming in that webinar. So our office will get in touch with you later on, Marcelo. Thank you so much. There's another question from Mateus. His question is to Matt. Well, Mateus shared his thoughts first. So I'm going to go over what he wrote. So if ideally we should consume 2.5 grams of leucine per day, and for that, considering WPI, I need to consume 1 scoop, approximately 33 grams. But if the minimum indicated is 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram, I should then have an intake of 64 grams of protein per day, according to the RDA. In that case, he says, I will be having a higher intake of leucine, much more than what I need. Based on that, should I consume plant-based protein? Because I would be consuming 64 grams and then not wasting leucine. Am I right, Matt? I am not considering weight gain or increased calories. So how do I reach the balance between protein intake in general vis-a-vis the intake of leucine? So Matt, this is extremely technical. I hope you have understood the question.
Sure, yes, thank you. Very clear, so appreciate the question. And thinking through the practical application of some of these concepts that I discussed here today, so that's great. One point, though, that kind of impacts the framing of the question is that the leucine recommendations that you referred to, which I talked about in my presentation, the goal or recommendation from different health authorities around 2.5 to 3 grams of leucine, those recommendations were per meal, not per day. So if we were to go at the high end of that range, 3 grams of leucine per meal, that would be around 9 grams of leucine per day. So in that instance, it would significantly change the framing of your question. So there wouldn't be this disparity that you were thinking regarding trying to hit targets for total leucine, as well as how that would impact total protein intake. So it would be much more in a range in where you're not going to significantly exceed total protein intake ranges to try to hit those 3 grams of leucine per meal. The other point I just want to mention from a concept standpoint is your reference to the RDA as that kind of protein intake goal. And you may recall on one of my slides, I talked about the RDA, and I also talked about the acceptable macronutrient distribution range. And it's important to look at both of these recommendations when trying to prescribe or have a target for protein intake for an individual or even a population. That RDA is established as the minimum protein intake to prevent deficiency. Again, it's not meant to be as a ceiling. So depending on some of these calculations and how you may be working through them, again, the RDA does not need to be looked upon as a ceiling by which, consuming additional protein above the RDA is either not going to have a benefit or be negative when it comes to health. Actually, that's a fairly low and conservative solely established to prevent deficiency. You may recall on that slide, I showed the RDA in comparison to the acceptable macronutrient distribution range, say, again, for a 70 kilogram weighing individual and a 2,000 calorie diet. And the RDA was about 56 grams, if I'm remembering correctly, of protein per day, while the AMDR ranged, much broader, right? 50 grams to 175 grams. So you have that very large window to play in. And again, the particular target would be impacted by a number of individual factors in terms of the person's total diet, their calorie goals, their health, body composition and goals, etc., could all play a role there.
Ok, muito obrigada.
Thank you so much. Mateus, I hope that that you understood the answer. If not, let us know. We also received the question from Andrea at the very beginning of Matt's presentation. She asks about what type of soy protein was used in that comparison you had in your slides.
Yes, thank you, Andrea, and thank you for sending that question in, because as the slides were going in the presentation, I was able to check my files to look back specifically from that paper by Volek and colleagues for that particular study. So it was a whey protein concentrate in comparison to a soy protein isolate in that particular study. The other thing I will just mention in that regard is that those two supplements were matched for total protein content. They weren't matched on weight. So in the big picture, you know, whether they're isolates or concentrates, it really shouldn't matter much, because, you know, total weights were able to be adjusted to provide the matched protein content, and actually they matched calorie content as well. And those were verified by 5 different samples that were tested at an independent laboratory. So again, if you're interested, I do believe these slides will be available, the slides in the recording, for all attendees, and all of the studies I referenced, the reference is on that slide. So you could look at those papers, or if you have a challenge in getting them, Carolina can connect us so that I could provide full text papers for any of the things that I presented if you're interested in reading more detail of those studies.
Perfeito. Obrigada, Matt. E só realmente
Perfect. Thank you, Matt. Yes, we can put you in contact and provide additional information later. Thank you for your question. Okay, now we have a question from Robson. And it's an interesting question. I'd like to ask Mary to help me answer this question. Okay, so Robson says, hello, my name is Robson. I work with dairy and meat products in the south of Brazil. I noticed that we face problems regarding the quality of whey protein around here, since most of the available products are mixed with other kind of proteins, but this information is not clear. Is there any solution for this problem, Mary?
That's a great question. And it kind of goes back to even the broader question of different sources of protein, because there can be differences even between one, soy protein to the next or whey protein to the next, depending upon how it's manufactured. So it's very important to develop relationships with your suppliers and ask them about their sources. Is it locally sourced? Do they import the materials? Are they blending materials? What is that? What are they starting with, and how are they handling and processing the material that's getting to you? Obviously, you can put in place specifications, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you always will receive the same product. So it's important to benchmark your products over time. So depending upon the type of product, whether it's a water binding or viscosity or browning or whatever functionality you're looking for in your ingredient to work in your formulation, you should put together a routine test for your supplier on those attributes to make sure it's staying consistent. It's especially important when you're dealing with some of the newer sources as they come online, because they may continue to scale their process to make their products more functional, which is great. But if they make that change and you're not prepared for that change, it might impact your formulation. So it's always a good practice to do and have those relationships and develop those relationships, because in the end, you and your supplier work hand in hand, and you want to make sure you have that consistent, safe supply. You want to make sure that a special need and let's to your product. Many times, if you have a good relationship with the supplier, they may have some different variations of products that can help you address that need to save you time and energy and efficiency during your process. An example might be if it's an acidified beverage, possibly providing a pre-acidified protein. So the amount of acid that you need to add on your end may be less in the total process. So it just really depends upon your application, but developing that relationship helps you. It helps your supplier know what you need and identify the gaps. And it also helps your customers because in the end, they have a wonderfully safe and tasty product to consume. So I hope that answers the question.
Sim, responde. E eu só quero
Sure did. I'd also like to add more information and also provide extra question to Mariangela, because Mariangela asked, how can we contact protein suppliers in the US? Our work here in our office as a USDEC office in South America is to facilitate contact with the US suppliers. And as Mary said, it is very important to establish these relationships with suppliers, have product tests, and have the US in mind as a reliable source of proteins and ingredients in general. So my additional answer is keep in contact with our office and we'll be able to put you in contact with reliable suppliers. There is another question that I would like Terry to comment on. We received a question asking, what is the difference between milk proteins from the US versus milk proteins from other sources? So why should we talk to these suppliers in particular? So maybe Terry can help us with this question.
Thanks, Caroline. I appreciate that question because, of course, the majority of what we were speaking about during this webinar was about comparing different types of protein sources. But of course, comparing different suppliers of dairy proteins is really important as well. And we recognize that in the US, we are not your only choice. We have strong competition from all around the world, particularly from Europe and New Zealand, make great protein products as well. But I would like to emphasize, that the US produces, really high quality, year-round, safe, clean, sustainably produced products. We're a big country, so we have a lot of different protein processors. So there's a wide variety of processes and products to choose from. So you have a lot of choices. In addition, as I mentioned in the presentation, the U.S. Dairy industry has the smallest greenhouse gas footprint per unit of milk produced in the entire world. And this is compared to every other country in the world. And we take a lot of pride in that. U.S. farmers as well as U.S. processors have worked very hard over the last, I would say, 30 years at least, to improve their processes, both from a sustainability, animal care, as Mary talked about, and also just making clean, safe products. So, and plus we have River Global, who is a great resource for us in South America. So we feel that we do bring a lot of advantages to the table. If you have specific requirements, the processors in the U.S. are willing to work with you to, understand what your requirements are. And that may even include making, let's say, a customized product if you have customized specs or functionality requirements. So, we're open to working with you, having a complete, relationship. So, any questions that you have, feel free to bring them to us. But we really strongly, want to emphasize that we, that we're a supplier that you can rely on, and, please reach out to us regarding your needs.
I might also add on that, as Terry mentioned, there are many customized products that are available here in the US. And it's important to, like I said, put your needs up front, but not just your needs, but also your process. Because depending upon your process, there may be ways you can use a customized ingredient that will save you money in the end with how you create your product, and not just from a protein perspective, but dairy proteins in particular can be highly functional, so they can actually help, depending upon what you're putting together. You may even recoup some savings on stabilizers and hydrocolloids and or flavors. It just depends upon your finished product and what your needs are and how you do your process. So that, once again, having those relationships, having those conversations can not only save you headaches, but can also potentially save you money. So don't forget to think about your process and share more of that information with your suppliers.
Just one more point about that. I mean, to add to Mary's point about saving money by potentially being able to, limit the use of other ingredients, in addition to saving money, you'll also end up having a cleaner label, a cleaner ingredient statement, which is something that a lot of your, is very popular today and a lot of consumers are looking for.
Muito verdade, é uma tendência
That's true. This is a trend we see in the market. Thank you, Terry and Mary, for your question, for your answers. I think that Maria Angela and Robson's questions were answered. And talking about market trends, we also had another question we received, and maybe Matt can help me with this one. This goes along the lines of sustainability. The question is, consumers are increasingly aware of sustainability. The environmental impact is one of their considerations in their food choices. Could you please talk about the environmental impact of dairy proteins vis-a-vis other types of proteins?
Yeah, sure. Happy to speak on that topic. As I touched on very briefly, and then, Terry and Mary also touched on elements of sustainability. It's certainly a very important topic, and one in which the U.S. dairy industry is committed to addressing and striving for continuous improvement across the broad topic of sustainability. And there are a couple of points I want to mention in the framing of that discussion and that question. And really, the first is, when comparing environmental impact of dairy proteins and compared to other proteins, one critical point that you need to ensure is that you're comparing similar types of data. In the US, we have a phrase, comparing apples to apples, so to speak, because as many of you are familiar with, there are multiple stages of a food or product's life cycle, right? From growing the raw ingredient to processing that ingredient on farm, to then sending it to a processor for potential additional processing, and all the other steps that take that product or ingredient to a consumer's table and be ready for consumption. Now, there are elements or impacts on the environment across that entire life cycle of the product. And when we're looking at, again, whether it's scientific papers or lay press articles that make statements regarding comparisons of one protein or food compared to the other, we really need to look at that source data to ensure that the stages of the life cycle from which that environmental impact measure, let's say greenhouse gas, for example, was derived, are the same when looking at one food or one protein compared to the other. Because if you cannot validate that information, then any of the conclusions made from those two data points really are not valid, because again, there are a variety of methodologies and a variety of ways in which this is done, and you really need to be sure you're making those similar comparisons. Now, when talking about U.S. dairy specifically, U.S. dairy completed a full life cycle assessment. That means, from the growing of milk and dairy on the farm all the way to the consumer's table. We did that for milk production in about 2007. And even today, it remains one of the most comprehensive and science-based life cycle assessments available conducted in any agricultural sector. And it's been published in peer-reviewed scientific journals. So these are independently validated and credited data. what we learned was that, dairy contributes about 2% of total US greenhouse gas emissions, 5.1% of total water, and 3.7% of total farmland. So, I think this is very modest, and particularly when you factor that into the quality of the nutrition that is provided for that very modest environmental impact, because we know all food production has an environmental impact. And this brings me to my last point that I want to make here when bridging and thinking about that cost, the environmental cost to benefit ratio, and in this case, nutritional benefit. And something that I did touch on very briefly, but I'll speak to a bit more again in wrapping this question, is that, often you'll see different foods, or let's say protein ingredients, compared with their environmental impact. Again, we'll use greenhouse gas as the example. Based on a functional unit is the term used. Greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram of product or per ton of product, right? So a mass, a weight measure. Now, when thinking about nutrition and thinking about the broad benefit of that environmental cost, the weight does not give a judge of the benefit. Certainly not the nutritional benefit, right? So there are ways in which to do that. One would simply be calories. The greenhouse gas produced for calories provided. But another one, particularly when you're talking about protein ingredients, is looking at the protein quality. And there have been a few publications which has looked at comparisons with greenhouse gas production versus a quality of the protein produced. And when that is done, and you look at dairy compared to various plant sources, that disparity or difference that is evident when you're looking at greenhouse gas per weight of the food produced is significantly reduced, or even in sometimes flipped, where dairy proteins will have less greenhouse gas produced when normalized for the protein quality. So again, I think hopefully those give you some indicators to look for when thinking about environmental impact. But again, either on our thinkusdairy.org website or others can comment on impact. And I see Mary has a comment that she'd like to add.
Yes, and just to follow on to what you were saying, Matt, I think people I know a lot of people don't understand where their food comes from. And, the charts that I showed you, the plant protein today, because of the steps that are involved to extract it and solubilize it, I mean, it's not sustainable. Those co-product streams that are coming off are consumed by animals. They're consumed by cows. I mean, think of soybeans. A lot of soybeans are consumed by cows, of those streams that come off at the beginning. So, when you think about sustainability, you have to think about everything in its whole. And I will say one thing about the dairy industry. When I started my career, they did not know what to do with their co-product streams. And that was right when we started doing research in animals to see what benefit it might have in animals. And here we are all these years later, and we hear Matt talk about how highly nutritious whey protein is and how it functions in the body. And so, that took, 20, 30 years of evolution to get that processing down so that the dairy industry could use all of those co-product streams. So for instance, the permeate that I talked about before is a great high value added ingredient that can be used in certain formulations to reduce added sodium or to enhance the flavor of a savory product. So it's important to realize that when you think about the whole picture. So I just wanted to clarify that, because I don't think we always think about the end product, not where it comes from and how it gets to there, and that there's side streams that come off.
I can just add a little bit more to that. So as Mary mentioned, the cows eat, what cows eat is foods that humans can't, right? And so that's putting products that would otherwise go to waste, putting them to use. Cows also graze on land that can't always efficiently be used to grow crops. So in a way, cows are very efficiently putting the land and all of these, what we think of as waste materials, to use. So it makes dairy really a super efficient, protein source. And when we think in terms of, feeding the growing population of the world, we're going to need more food than what's being produced now. And dairy can really help contribute by being such an efficient source of protein. It's not going to take as many resources to produce as much dairy as it would of some plant-based crops to be able to feed people and to feed people well, not just to feed people low quality proteins, but to feed people well. So that's really very important to keep that in mind.
Muito obrigada a todos.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It was a very thorough answer. We are reaching the end of this event, but I would like to ask two different questions. They're very important. The first one, let me just get this one. Too many questions, I guess. This one is for Matt. Is there a difference in the health benefits of whey protein concentrates versus whey protein concentrates, isolates, and hydrolysates? Is that one better for muscle health?
Yes, thank you for that question. I think a very common question, obviously, as we've kind of alluded to here, and many of you are aware, there are a number of different options when thinking about which dairy protein to select. I'll say, generally speaking, from a nutrition perspective, there is not much data that would drive that decision in terms of, as I mentioned, muscle health here. While we generally know, right, an isolate is a bit more concentrated in terms of its protein percent in relation to its overall weight in comparison to a concentrate, but so it might be a bit more efficient, again, on a weight perspective of delivering the amount of protein and essential amino acid that might be needed for a certain population. There is not, beyond that, there is really not much data at all to suggest an isolate would provide greater health benefit in comparison to a concentrate. Now, one consideration with that from a nutrition or health perspective could be the lactose content. For certain populations that are, lactose insensitive, and we know there's a wide variability in terms of the amount of lactose individuals who report lactose intolerance can tolerate or handle. I believe whey protein concentrate is about 4% lactose by weight, while whey protein isolate is maybe 0.5 to 1%. So in that respect, if your target consumer, that they have some concerns regarding lactose, that might be a reason to select an isolate over a concentrate. The last point I'll mention there in terms of the different options are when thinking about hydrolysates. Now we know hydrolysates are partially digested forms of that whey protein, and those are usually, talked about in terms of, a faster, more available, faster available essential amino acids into the blood and then into the tissues, right? And yes, that is true. Because they're partially digested, they will show up in your bloodstream quicker than if you're having the intact. But I will say I am not aware of any data that would show that subtle difference in the speed with which those amino acids are available in the blood have really any true difference when it comes to a true health outcome. So I think, while there is some information there, I think more would need to be done to really show that matters. I mean, just a whey protein concentrate is a very fast acting, fast digested, quickly available protein source. So again, from a health perspective, I really think it comes down to lactose. But as Mary or Terry can speak to, there might be, there certainly are more considerations from an application side as why one might select, one of those proteins in comparison to the other.
Yes, typically hydrolysates are used more for digestive or immune compromised individuals that maybe cannot digest completely. So it's easier for them to absorb those nutrients. The other area where hydrolysates are used a lot is specifically in bar formulations, where you're looking for shelf stability of your product over time. And so a blend of whey protein hydrolysates with other milk proteins or whey proteins helps give you the correct chew and texture that you're looking for to be maintained on the shelf. So they're important to consider in bars, and also just more snack or things where the shelf life may change over time.
Muito obrigada. Pessoal, eu sei que eu falei que eram duas.
Thank you so much. I know I mentioned we'll have 2 questions, but we are really pressed for time. So unfortunately, I'll have to close. But before you leave, I know it's lunchtime here in Brazil, but I have one last request for you. We kindly ask you to please fill out our assessment form. And with that, we will close. Oh, actually, it's a poll question. So please, I will give you some seconds. And once again, we will make the recording of this webinar available. We will also send you the certificate, and we will certainly answer all unanswered questions via email. We apologize, but we did receive many questions. Another comment is just to, once again, to underline that our office is here to support you. You can send us your questions about formulations or to request technical reports. I kindly also invite you to visit our website that will be displayed soon. So let's share the poll results. So 71% found this webinar excellent. Thank you very, very much. We will also share the emails of our speakers, so you can get in touch with them directly if you wish. And also from our office. We have our office here in São Paulo, and we cover the entire South America. Clarissa and I will answer your questions. And the website is www.thinkusadairy.org. You may say, well, I don't know English, but don't worry, we do provide a Portuguese translation on our website. And now, really, to close, I'd like to ask our speakers for their final remarks. Terry, final remarks?
Thank you, Carolina, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I hope that it was obvious that we love talking about dairy proteins. We're very excited about this subject, and we really enjoyed having this opportunity to help you learn more, and hope that it was useful for you. So thanks very much for attending.
Obrigada. Matt?
Thank you. Matt?
Yes, again, echoing Terry's comments, thank you all for your time and interest today. And certainly, building upon things that were mentioned in our presentations, not only trying to, the benefits of developing relationships with your suppliers, but also developing relationships with our organization as well, USDEC and then River Global as a, conduit to providing our information. There's so much information to share. We did our best within the time allotted, but we can continue to help address individual questions and needs as you, think about how you want to utilize dairy proteins in your formulations.
Perfeito. Muito obrigada.
Nice. Perfect. Mary, your turn.
And I hope that you heard through some of my comments, the innovation potential in the world of protein continues to be strong. There's so many new and customized products out there, and that's why the relationship and conversation is important, but also that's where true innovation comes from. And as Matt shared, individuals need high quality, nutritious dairy proteins in their diets, and there's so many creative ways to turn it into other forms. It could be bites, it could be gels, it could be frozen desserts, all kinds of different food products. So the sky's the limit, and reach out to these resources. They're here. There's lots of application formulas, there's technical sheets, there's these webinars, there's so much information at your fingertips through USDEC and River Global. So please do not feel like you have to figure it out on your own. Come to them and they can help get you to the right people to find those resources as you're either designing your process or formulating your new product.
Perfeito. Muito obrigada, Mary.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Mary. Now it's my turn to say goodbye. Once again, I'd like to thank you all for joining us this morning. Once again, our website and the link for accessing the webinar. We will certainly share the recording and the presentation. So thank you very much. I wish you a great rest of the day. Thank you. Bye-bye.